ICMA University is pleased to present this online program entitled Moving Beyond the Current Crisis, a plan to reopen our communities. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this program. I would like to draw everyone's attention to the links box located on the left of your screen. This area contains links to handouts and resources related to today's program. When you click on a link, a separate web browser window or tab will open so that you can view or save each item. The webinar evaluation link is also in this area. You must be logged in to ICMA University to access the survey from here, but you can also find it on your dashboard after today's program by clicking on the program title. It is my pleasure to turn the program over to Mark Ott, who will introduce today's presenter. Mark is the Executive Director of ICMA, and under his leadership, the association has grown to 13,000 members worldwide, while he has been championing staff empowerment, fiscal sustainability, innovation, and the expansion of the organization's global footprint. Prior to joining ICMA, Mark served for 9 years as a city manager for Austin, which was recognized as the best managed city in America. He has had a long and distinguished career in municipal management, serving in leadership roles in both Texas and Michigan. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Darian. I'm very pleased to be with you today. Before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to applaud everyone on the webinar for the work that you are all doing right now to overcome this global pandemic. You are navigating uncharted waters, and I want to recognize you for taking the time to see beyond crisis management to think about what's next. And that's where today's seminar will take us. I connected with Richard Florida a few weeks ago now when he shared his latest article on reopening our communities. Richard is a professor at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management and School of Cities, where he also serves as chief urbanist. He is a distinguished fellow at New York University and co-founder of CityLab, which is dedicated to cities and urbanism. He is the author of more than 10 books, including The Rise of the Creative Class, and more than 100 book chapters and articles in peer-reviewed academic journals. Richard has spoken at ICMA conferences and has lent us his considerable wisdom on a wide range of topics, especially focusing on building sustainable communities. We are excited to have him share his thoughts and take your questions on moving beyond the current crisis, a plan to reopen our communities. Richard, I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. Thanks to ICMA, and thanks to each and every one of you who are joining our great city managers who are, on the front lines of moving our cities through this crisis period from the current period of immediate all-hands-on-deck mobilization to reopening and to recovery. I think we're all of us are in your debt. And, I live in Toronto. I've been speaking with our city manager there. I spend the winters. We're actually in Miami Beach. We can't get back to our main house, but been speaking to the city manager here. So I know what you're dealing with, and talking to many, many city leaders, community leaders throughout the United States, in Canada, and the world. I want to speak for, I don't know, half an hour, maybe a little more, and really then leave time for your questions, making sure that you have time to adequately ask any questions that you think that you see fit, and really have a dialogue with each and every one of you. So let's get started. Here's just a really brief overview of what I want to talk about. And I think, like so many people, and Mark and I have talked about this, I think when this first hit, I think I was shell-shocked. I had tremendous anxiety. I have 2 young kids. One's 2.5, the other's 4. Not knowing what to do, not knowing how to think, not being able to think. And hopefully by really focusing on some of these issues, taking a step back, because I'm not on the front lines as you are. I'm an academic and a thought leader. Taking a step back and trying to think about what can we learn about this virus What can we learn about the virus and its impact on cities? I went back and read, it's funny, I've had nearly a 4-decade career in urbanism and in city development and in economic development. And if you had asked me a month ago what I knew about pandemics and health in cities, I would have told you next to nothing. In all those 4 decades, we talked about strengthening city economies and the fiscal outlook of cities and how to plan cities, how to design cities, how to attract talent. I never gave this a second thought. I had heard of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. I'd read about the London cholera epidemic. I just learned, by the way, that I was born in 1957 in the middle of a pandemic. My parents never told me about it. I went back and talked to, because I'm one of the youngest cousins, I went back and talked to my elder cousins, and they said that many of our grandparents' generation were Italian American, who came from Italy, lost young siblings. I had no idea, and I had not really thought about the role of, now I'd heard about the role of health issues and sanitation issues, ventilation, air and sunlight in the building codes, modern sewer systems and sanitation systems, and they had a health effect, but it wasn't something I paid attention to. So I went back and tried to learn as much as I could about the way these great health crises and epidemics, infectious diseases, affect our cities. So not just the current crisis, but going back through history and reading a lot of histories and talking to a lot of people. I've tried to get a sense of what are the factors that have affected certain cities in becoming a hotspot, where this darn thing first set foot, and then also tried to think about what are some of the factors that leave some of our communities more vulnerable or protected. And then one of the things I've been writing about a lot and will write more on is how will our cities and communities be reshaped? And I think I can offer some intriguing insights. I don't have it all figured out, but I think looking back on history, looking at what's happening today, looking at how this epidemic is playing out, this health crisis, we can see some trends and tendencies, though it's still early days. And then I think what's most interesting to me is thinking about how our cities, our communities, and all of you can help communities to reopen and recover. And I know that all of you, because I've talked to quite a few city managers, as well as mayors, as well as governors, I know that all of you are on the front lines, really equipping yourself for the mobilization effort, the healthcare surge capability, financial mobilization to help protect small business, to get money in the hands of people who need it and organizations who need it. But I tend to think of this as a 3-stage recovery plan, and that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about with all of you. Stage 1 is mobilization. That's what we're in today, and I think where I can help and others like me can help, and others you can turn to are in stages 2 and 3. What is the reopening plan, and how do we begin to think about what a sensible, safe, and secure reopening plan looks like after we get through this period of immediate mobilization? And then as we move downstream, what does an actual recovery plan look like? So basically, my big takeaway, if I had to summarize my big takeaway of the big picture, looking back through all of history, and, in a way, we're better equipped. I know it seems like this is so daunting and so hellacious, but we're so much better equipped to handle a pandemic today, even though we have been caught unprepared. Our federal government was not as prepared as it should be. Our states and localities are coming to the rescue. But if you look back in history, we have better medical technology today. We have the ability to mobilize to create surge capability. We have much better economic tools at our disposal to mitigate financial and economic impacts. We have the internet and the ability to connect and share information. We have the ability to, I could have only imagined if this had happened 15 years ago, not just to communicate via internet and social media, but to be quite honest, I haven't had to go to a store in 3 weeks because there is a delivery infrastructure that can bring things to me. Now, we're very privileged, those of us, and we'll talk about that privilege in a minute. But, and if there is and I'm a New Yorker, I'm from New Jersey, I have a distinguished fellowship at NYU, if there's a silver lining in the fact that that great city is being hit so hard, with this darn virus hitting our great city so hard, Dr. Fauci says something that, he's such a brilliant man, and he says, we have to learn from the virus. We can't know in advance. The virus has to teach us. In a way, New York is a laboratory, and other great cities where not only are we developing the surge capacity, converting the Javits Center, my friends in real estate, converting hotels and other buildings that can be rolled out, but we're developing therapies in New York, how to better equip ventilators, when to use ventilators, what to think of as antiviral cocktails, and of course work towards a vaccine. The ability to mobilize our scientific community puts us in a position that is unlike any other pandemic that's ever struck. Still, if we look back through all of human history, the force of urbanization has been a greater force than infectious disease. I've just read a great book by a fellow named Charles Kenny. It's not published. I'm going to publish a Q&A with him. He's written a book. It's about to come out in a few months about the history of cities and infectious disease. Urbanization, even in primitive times, back with the London cholera epidemic, in the horrific tuberculosis epidemics, the Spanish flu of 1918, which took place during a war. When you think about that, I lived in Pittsburgh for nearly 20 years. I've now read all the histories of Pittsburgh in the Great Pandemic. People weren't able to socially distance. We were in a war mobilization effort. People had to go to work in factories. Pittsburgh's working class was packed, chock-a-block, into crowded tenements. The air was covered in soot and pollution. Most working people didn't have health insurance, didn't have access to hospitals. Wealthy people did. And even so, when you think about the long sweep of history, the rise of great cities from Rome to Vienna to London to New York to Chicago, it hasn't been dampened at all. In fact, what I was telling you, I didn't know. As a student of urbanization and an urbanist, I had no idea that pandemics played a role in urbanization. I had forgotten about them. And so urbanization is the stronger force. And here's a data point for you. I went back and I looked at the pattern of urbanization in the United States across the early part of the 20th century. New York City was the largest city in 1910. It was the largest city in 1920. And it was the largest city in 1930. Chicago was the second largest city in 1910. It was the second largest city in 1920. And it was the second largest city in 1930. And even Philadelphia, where many people have argued that it really bungled social distancing, it allowed that parade to go on. It didn't flatten the curve. It had a big, big bulge. Even in Philadelphia remained one of America's largest cities. Pittsburgh remained a large city, and even Detroit, with its early industrialization and its pollution, zoomed up the ranks of American cities. It was outside the top 10 in 1910 and became a top 5 city in 1930. The point being is that infectious disease and pandemics, as gut-wrenching and as horrible and as the toll they take on life, are a weaker force than the force of urbanization, the force that brings us together, that powers our economy, that makes us strong. So one of the things I've been working on and thinking about a lot is how this COVID-19 crisis will shape and reshape our society. I'm actually in the middle of writing a big feature essay for the Atlantic magazine. The one thing we know, and I wrote about this at City Lab, I can send out a link later and make it available. You can go to the site. I actually wrote a piece on how this COVID-19 is reinforcing some of the inequity in our society, some of the class division that we've seen, some of the inequity with regard to socioeconomic class, the labor force, and race. I believe in New Orleans, 70% of the cases and or fatalities from COVID-19 have been on the black community. It's hit hardest at the least advantaged communities. And what we did was simply look at how COVID-19 it permeates the way we work. About a third of Americans are professional and knowledge workers, like all of us on this webinar. We can work remotely. We can socially isolate ourselves and our families and work at home. And in many of our cases, if we live in metropolitan areas, we never even go to the store. We can have groceries or food delivered to us. And one of the things I've noticed, it's a trivial point, but when I want to look at my food delivery apps, I can now get food delivered from every fancy schmancy restaurant in my city. I mean, it's sort of unbelievable the things that can be brought to you. Never mind, if I need something from Amazon or another product or whatever. But 30 million Americans are frontline service workers. They're grocery clerks, they're delivery people, they work in warehouses, there are emergency responders. They're exposed in their work. They're exposed because many of them depend on transit to get to work in our big cities. They're exposed on how they get to work, and they're exposing their families because many of those are less well off, less advantaged. There's a high percentage of immigrants. Many of them live in multi-generational families. So there is a class divide. And then, people have talked about density. And it is true that density has been a factor in the propagation of infectious disease. It's been a factor in the propagation of infectious disease for all of human history, a much bigger factor then than now. But one of the things I distinguished in another article I wrote for CityLab is the difference between two kinds of density. There's rich place density, the kind of density that I live in a condominium apartment with staff that's making sure everything is clean, where I can shelter in place, where we actually have a little outdoor space attached to our condominium where my kids can play, and we rigged up a playground, and have stuff delivered to us. But contrast that with poor place density, where people are living in large multi-generational households, in apartment buildings. They can't socially distance. And, as bad as that is in the advanced countries, in the United States and Canada and other advanced countries, what really keeps me up at night, when I wake up at night in a cold sweat, is when I think of what might happen to the global south. You look at those pictures coming out of India, or you look at the pictures coming out of the barrios of South America or Africa, the global slums, and you think about if this pandemic hits over the summer, if it moves from the global north to the global south, I mean, the tragedy that awaits where density is just people packed on top of people with no capacity. They have to go about not only work, but their daily sustenance is dependent upon being out with others. So there's a divide in density as well as in work. Now, the other thing I've been thinking about a lot is how this health crisis may reinforce some of our geographic divide. Brookings just yesterday came out with a wonderful report, and in fact, I wrote a report. The first report Mark mentioned was done with the Brookings Metro program. Brookings came out with another wonderful report yesterday, which said that since about the year 2015, America's geography has been changing in a very positive way. The big superstar cities and tech hubs, I call this winner-take-all urbanism, winner-take-all geography, which have been getting so many of the good jobs in finance and technology and entertainment. Places like New York and San Francisco, Mark's old hometown of Austin, Texas, Seattle, LA in film, the Bay Area, that there was a shift. That what was happening in America is we were seeing what Steve Case, the high technologist and venture capitalist, calls the rise of the rest. We were seeing a shift from these expensive metropolitan areas to smaller metropolitan areas, and from center cities that have been attracting a lot of talent to outlying suburbs and rural areas. My worry is that this COVID-19 may reinforce the winner-take-all urbanism. Now, it's going to be a complicated picture, and we'll get into it. May reinforce the winner-take-all urbanism the way the 2008 economic crisis did. I worry that if air travel is restricted over the long run, or even the medium run, and people can't commute from far, and if there is fear of transit and trains, some of the concentration effects that pushed people to these superstar metros will be accentuated. Now, I do believe that we'll have a breathing period, if you will. Office buildings will not be so attractive. Co-working spaces people will be scared of. People will be nervous about big condominium apartments and apartment buildings. So big cities may have some affordability relief, housing, and an ability to address what I call the new urban crisis, and they should take advantage. And I also believe, which we'll get to, is that even if this occurs, many smaller communities, smaller cities, smaller metros, suburbs and rural areas will also have opportunity, but the communities all of us will need to act strategically and intentionally and proactively to make our communities safe and secure, because I think this is going to be paramount. Economics, jobs are going to be important, but also how we feel safe and secure with our family. We're going to have to act proactively and strategically and with intention to ensure that. It's clear now, and I wrote about this for CityLab, that some kinds of communities have been more vulnerable than others. And, you know, I want to distinguish between the factors that have propagated the virus and the factors that have caused the hotspots to begin with. I think when you think about the hotspot communities, the communities that were hit hardest with this virus to begin with, I think they boil down into three types. The first type are the global gateway cities. The New Yorks, the Londons, the big cities that have a lot of foreign travelers, a lot of tourists, and large immigrant populations that go back and forth. And that pattern of tourism, of travel, of trade brought the virus to big, dense cities. But they're not the only places that have been hit hard in this first wave. The second type of places, I think you could call them industrial hubs. And Detroit, where my wife's family, in fact, all of my kids' cousins on the maternal side, on my wife's side, are living in greater Detroit, and all of her family. The industrial supply linkages between Wuhan, China, where so many of those auto companies have plants, and also northern Italy. Northern Italy has very tight supply linkages with China. So some of these industrial supply chain, tourist towns like New Orleans that had a Mardi Gras, that have people visiting from other parts of the country. And then I think the other one, which has been a big propagator and hotspot in the United States, are jet set resort communities. You know, some of the hardest hit communities in our country are the ski slope communities of Colorado and Idaho. Some of the places that were hard hit by this virus to begin with were the ski slopes of the alpine communities of Europe. And then they brought, you know, I have a colleague in Sweden who's sure, and they, you know, in Sweden it's very interesting because they're not doing quite a lockdown. They're doing social distancing through giving of information, people doing the right thing. But she was sure her son and husband had COVID-19 because they had gone on a ski trip in Italy. And they didn't, by the way, Sweden, as well managed, didn't have tests either. They couldn't test husband and son, but she was convinced her son and husband probably had this, and many other kids in their town, because they had all gone on a ski trip to Italy. So these jet set ski communities. But those are the places that became hotspots. What I've tried to think about are what are some of the factors that propagate this in our communities and make some of our communities more vulnerable and others more protected. And when I look at the media and hear the conventional wisdom, I hear two things mentioned time and time again. There are two things that either propagate or staunch the virus. The first is density, and people here, you know, piling on New York. New York is a dense place. That's why it's getting hit so hard. And, or the other argument being that places that have been saved from the virus are those that have locked down early. Now, both of those arguments have more than a grain of truth. All of the analysis that I've seen or my team has done has shown that density is a factor. If you run a simple statistical analysis, the density, statistically speaking, is positive and significant. It's clear by looking at the anecdotal data, and we do have some statistical information because people can track movement using Google and other mapping data. We now know that yes, social distancing has played a role. The ability to lock down or distance has played a role. But they're not the only factors. And people point to San Francisco, and a city I love, and say, look at how successful they've been vis-a-vis New York, New Orleans being the hardest hit community now in the United States in terms of per capita deaths or per capita cases. and Detroit. And all I want to do is point out is that San Francisco is a very different kind of community than Detroit or New Orleans. Not making a value judgment, it is socio-demographically and economically very different. This virus has hit hardest at places with older people. If you look at northern Italy, it has one of the oldest population demographies in the advanced world. The virus hits differently at places that have different class structures. The San Francisco Bay Area, particularly the San Jose metropolitan area, has the largest percentage of workers who can work remotely of any metropolitan area in the United States. They can socially distance. They can shelter in place. It has, in turn, the lowest percentage of workers doing frontline positions. New York is fifth. It's a very advanced economy, but it ranks fifth in the share of workers in frontline service positions. New Orleans and Detroit are much higher. Higher educational attainment, higher incomes, which give people the ability to avoid and socially distance. Certain kinds of community are fitter. They have fewer pre-existing conditions. They have lower rates of obesity, lower rates of heart and lung disease, higher rates of fitness, lower BMIs. One thing that some communities have been impugned for, they talk about gentrification, and they talk about cities, San Francisco and Seattle being the signature examples, Washington, D.C., as being childless communities, communities which are filled with young people for a whole variety of reasons that we know about. They're expensive, suburban schools are better than urban schools, that they have a lot of young people and very few children. Well, the fact that they have very few children are a vector. It makes them less vulnerable to the virus. Other kinds of cities have a lot more kids, multi-generational families. A big city like New York, a city like Detroit with a large minority community, my wife's Jordanian, a large Arabic community, a large immigrant community. Toronto would be another example of this, large ethnic and immigrant communities. I could go down the list. Those communities tend to have higher degrees of multi-generational families, where mom and dad and granddad and grandma and kids get together much more. This is a good thing. When Robert Putnam wrote his famous books on social capital, the biggest area of social capital in the world, his base case was northern Italy. The extended social capital of family and friends and tightly well. Lyman Stone, the demographer, tweeted, he said one of the great ironies and tragedies is that social capital may turn out to be a victim, something that makes our communities more vulnerable. And then religiosity. We know now that it's not only been conferences and cruise ships, that temples and churches have been big vectors. And so religion has been part of the fabric that binds us together. And, it's funny for you guys listening in. I went to Catholic school. I'm Roman Catholic. But we have our kids in Jewish school because it's a really good school. And in that Jewish school, they're not just Christian kids like our kids. There's Islamic kids in that school. It's a very secular, very interesting school. But the point is that religiosity, that religious worship, which is so important to the fabric of our communities, places that are more religious, that have higher, Orthodox temples, higher, deeply religious worship, they've become vectors. And that isn't to put a value judgment on any of this. It's just to say that it's not simply density and lockdown. Those are two important factors, but there are other characteristics of our towns and our communities that make some more vulnerable than others, and we shouldn't impugn. We shouldn't just say, well, some locked down early and did better, and some locked down later and did worse, and others were dense and others weren't dense. Let's step back and say there are other factors that matter. One of the things that's harder for me, and I want to be very candid about this, that I'm thinking very hard about, but I don't think we can know. And it really depends on how long this goes on, and we'll come to a few more slides on that. But, if this is over quickly, if for some reason we can damp it down with social distancing, if for some reason our great scientific and medical community come up with some therapies in the next few months, if we get a vaccine on a rapid response, with Bill Gates building those factories, billions of dollars to build up the factories, and we get a vaccine, I don't think much is going to change. There will be, if this goes on for 12 to 18 to 24 months, I think we're going to see some significant changes. But many people, when they hear about this virus, say, there's going to be a flight from density. What's going to happen is what we're seeing in New York. Everyone left New York who could and ran to the Hamptons, or they ran to the Poconos, or they ran to the Catskills, or they ran to the Hudson Valley, or they came to Miami. And, now we have these whole rumors, people looking for New York plates and trying to get them. It's ridiculous, Make them quarantine, make them do their thing, don't ban people from going to their second homes. That's not what Americans do. Don't put up border guards. But the past suggests that we don't see a real flight from density, that the power of density for our economy, for creating good jobs, for luring people, maybe not all people, is powerful. So I try to separate out push versus pull factors. And maybe that's a useful way for you to think about it. It's not all a rush from density. And, people talked about this in the wake of 9/11. Oh, big cities are going to collapse. Big cities like Washington and New York, they're targets. People are going to leave. They talked about this in the wake of the economic crash. Oh, people are going to get out of these places. Their economies are too vulnerable. They talked about this in the wake of, natural disasters, sea level rise, and it hasn't happened. But I think the way to think about this is pull versus push factors. So what are the pull factors? And I think remote work is a big one. I think this is something all of us have to think about who manage cities. And it may affect our tax bases, very, very interestingly. Remote work is something that was a trend that was already occurring, that was a trend that was on the upswing, and that people like. The funny thing is I've always been a remote worker. I've never liked going to the office. I've always been in semi-quarantine. But I found my kids like learning from home better. Like, they're little kids, and, they like mom and dad around. But boy, oh boy, they're much happier on their Zoom class than they were in class. So, and we've been working, my team and I have been working with Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Kaiser Foundation. They've made a remote work, and they call it Tulsa Remote. They give a $10,000 grant. They attach people to the community. They help them find an affordable house. They help them build, civic and social capital. They were getting so many applications. And when I go there, I see really interesting people from San Francisco or LA or New York or Chicago or Atlanta that moved there, not just because housing was affordable, but because they wanted to be part of a smaller, more tightly knit community. So I think remote work is here to stay. And I think it's not just something that benefits big cities. I think that's something that smaller metros and smaller rural communities can take advantage of and should. And it's something we need to think about. I think that fear of train and transit is going to be with us. I love trains and transit, but I'm being honest. If you ask me when I think I'll go back on a train or on a subway or on a bus or get on an airplane, I don't know. I'm scared. If I'm scared, someone who travels a lot and is used to urban transport, that I'm telling myself I'm probably not the only one. I think the other pull factor will be a desire for private amenities. I see it already. People are saying, I loved apartment life. I loved urban life. But I want a backyard. If I have kids, I want a place to put a swing set. I might even want a little pool, a place for them to take a dip. I think that the preference for contained living and private amenities is a big pull factor, which could pull people out of city centers. It could pull them away from close-in suburbs. One of my big worries, I've been such a fan of these close-in suburbs that are connected to big cities with transport and transit and train. You know them in your community. I could name dozens of them. I'm worried about those communities. People might not want to take the train anymore. And what really worries me is that what happens to big metropolitan areas that are already congested, Houston, Dallas, even more so New York, Chicago, Toronto. When people say, I'm scared of the train, I'm scared of the subway, I'm going to get my car and drive. Those big congested metros may have a congestion nightmare on their hands if we don't begin to think about remote work and staggered schedules as an alternative. And then I think we're going to see rural gentrification. I think that's a trend we were already seeing. I think Americans have always been, there's been some Americans and even creatives who love the urban Greenwich Village scene. But, going back to the 1920s and before, American creatives have loved country life. And, I keep thinking about Woodstock, the concert. And, Woodstock, the concert, came about not because it was a farm to put a concert on. Mike Lang, who produced Woodstock, was invited up to Woodstock because there were so many musicians and artists already out there, Bob Dylan and all the great artists and musicians, the band. And they said, why don't you open a recording studio? You have one in New York. Why don't you bring your recording studio out here? And he said, oh, I don't want to just have a recording studio. I can put a concert up together, and we can bring everybody together and bring attention to this. I think rural gentrification is a pull, and it's not just suburbanization. I think we're going to see rural areas become much more desired. But at the same time, there'll be push factors. Those clusters I mentioned at the outset, high tech in the Bay Area, finance in New York or London, media and entertainment in places like LA, you cannot do those things remotely. And if you're a young person, if you have a young child, a boy or girl, kid graduating college, MBA, whatever, computer science program, and you ask them where they're going to go, they're not going to head to the hills. They're not going to go to the exurbs in the rural areas. Those kids are going to go to where the great opportunities are. And in talking to people, they say it's not just about face-to-face contact to make the innovation or to make on the trading floor. If you want to make a career in those fields, you have to develop a personal network. You have to be highly embedded in those places to make the connections to get advanced. So I don't think they're going anywhere. As I mentioned, if air travel restrictions stay in place for any length of time, venture capitalists always say they have to be able to get to an investment quickly, within a couple of hours. The venture capitalists who are taking a plane to go to visit their investment in a second-tier city. The super commuters I saw in Miami, the hedge fund people, the financial people, the real estate people who said, I live in Miami, it's sun, it's fun, and I save on my taxes. It's going to be much harder to do if air travel is restricted or dangerous. So I think restrictions on air travel will cause some concentration. I think within urban areas, at every scale, walkable and bikeable areas will become more desirable. And I think particularly walkable, bikeable areas around economic clusters, around Lower Manhattan's financial district, around the high-tech quarters of Silicon Valley, around the LA films. We could go down. Around Nashville's Music Row. You go down a list of these things. The walkable, bikeable areas around these places will be very highly desired because people will want to be able to get there. And I think, we will see return of car commuting and the traffic and congestion that brings. So some people will want to be closer to where they work and avoid that. But I think you have to think in terms of push and pull, not one or the other. In its early days, depending on how long this goes, those trends will follow. It is clear, though, in my look back at history, if you look back at 1918, I mentioned everything I mentioned. New York grew stronger. Chicago was strong. Detroit and Pittsburgh were strong. Even Philadelphia. Our major metros didn't get hurt, but 1920 was the first mass era of suburbanization in American history. Now, you can't say it's all health because 1920 is when Henry Ford started producing those Model Ts, and the car it wasn't a streetcar and a subway and, to move people around. It was a car, so it's hard to disentangle those, but it is clear that back in 1918, 1920, it was the first time we've seen mass suburbanization. Now, of course, that even extended after the war, but I think it is even though our big cities, may remain stable, our metropolitan areas, we could see suburbanization and even a tilt towards rural areas. I think the economy, some parts of the economy will reconcentrate, but I think there'll be some flight from density in our population structure. But it's early days. It depends on how long this plays out, how exactly that will come to bear. What I want to spend just a few minutes on, and then we'll open this up, is how can we all prepare and plan for recovery? And I tend to think about that in three phases, and I think you'll find this interesting. And it's almost like disaster planning and disaster recovery with a slight tweak. Phase one, the phase we're in now, is mobilization. Lockdowns, social distancing, mobilization to provide that healthcare surge capacity, and economic mobilization. And by the way, look, I know our federal government bungled. I know where my politics are. I don't need to inflect them on you. My father told me, my dad enlisted the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. He said, Richard, They gave me a doughboy hat from World War I and some World War I surplus boots and a stick, because they didn't have a broomstick, because they didn't have a gun for me to train. He said the way we mobilized with women in our factories, he said by the time I got to England to deploy to, and he stormed the beaches at Normandy as an infantry soldier, he said we had everything. We had so much armaments. We had so much rations. We had so much stuff. We had everything we needed. I'm just heartened, given all the bungling and every finger pointing I could do, the way in which we have mobilized our medical capacity in New York, the way in which we have converted Javits Center and the Cathedral and the Four Seasons Hotel, and the way that's happening, you know, in community after community, the way we've mobilized to provide economic assistance. Now we can do more, and the way our states and localities have jumped into the breach, the leadership of our governors. I mean, it's remarkable. You know, I just think it gives you great faith in being an American and watching this, the ability to mobilize the private sector, philanthropy, the Gates Foundation, work on vaccines, the medical community. It's a mobilization that I never could have believed. Now, could it be managed better? Sure. But I think it's forcing us to consider the fact that we mobilize best locally in our cities, our states, with our private-public partnerships, which we do well, in our communities. And I think keep demanding that the federal government does it better. Yes, they could do it better. But our mobilization is from below, and that's what we're doing now. But we've got to think out, all of us, into phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 2 is reopening. We have to begin to plan now and put together the groups, the working group, the task forces, the planning and strategic capacity, so we don't get caught with our pants down again. We are not just going to pop open. There is not just going to be a day that we say, press a button, a reset button, and everything goes back to normal. This virus is going to be around. Is it around for 3 months? Is it around for 6 months? Do we get those antiviral therapies? Do we get a vaccine? Is it around for 12 to 18 months? We're going to have to be really vigilant, and that's going to take real planning. That's not something that we can do, just press a button and go. And then finally, the phase 3, we're going to have to position our economies. You know, let's say in this reopening phase we can get up to 75, 80, 90%. Parts of our economy will be hit hard. Parts of our economy will do better. We've got to position ourselves, our cities and communities, for a long-term recovery. How do we position our industries, our clusters, to recover? And, you know, you've seen this before, but here's what happens. You know, these are the waves, you know, in past pandemics, this one being 1918. You know, that played out over a good 18 months. Now, one difference, and I want to point this out, you notice that wave 2 is bigger here. That's because, look at the spring wave. It hit in June, you know, when the flu season was almost over. So we were hit smack dab in the middle of flu season. I think our first wave is going to be bigger. I also think with social distancing, lockdown, and the ability to develop medical therapy and better medical practice, we're going to have smaller. We're going to be able to put the second wave way down, way down. And, you know, I've already noticed that the epidemiologists are revising their death tolls lower. So that's telling me something. And maybe, if we're lucky, you know, we can mitigate this in 3 to 6 months, and we can start getting back to normal over 6 to 12 to 18 months. But I would be vigilant. And I would say let's plan for month 3 after initial mobilization through months 18 and 24 as possible reopening. If we go too far, if we stockpile too much stuff, if we go overboard, who cares? We'll be prepared. And the other thing, I just think it's important for all of us to recognize, we've been through a wave of these darn bugs. You know, if you think about SARS, which hit Hong Kong and Toronto, and then you think about Zika, and then you think about Ebola, and then you think about this, it's probably smart that we have a good mobilization, reopening, and recovery plan in place that we can call back should, unfortunately, this recur, or we get hit with another bug, hopefully not nearly as virulent in the future. 4 key dimensions I'm going to talk about. Health screenings and temperature checks. You already see in China and Singapore when you go to an airport or you go to a classroom or you go to an office building, they're doing a health screen and a temperature check. They're looking at whether you've coughed, where you've been, whether you're running a temperature. PPE, personal protective equipment. We know now, the studies show, with the old SARS epidemic that was incredibly deadly, If you were in a hospital setting, highly contagious, highly infectious, if you wore a mask, if you wore gloves, if you wore protective gear, and if you washed your hands, you had a 90% less chance of not getting SARS. So the masks, the gloves, the protective gear, and what I want to say here is that the mask, the gloves, and the protective gear need not look like some ragtag bandana tied across your mouth or a hazmat suit. That with the fashion community, the design community, the clothing manufacturing community in this, all of the great companies from Nike to Armor All, I could do that, Brooks Brothers, Banana Republic, Gap, we can make personal protective gear that looks nice and doesn't scare the bejesus out of kids and young people and families. We're going to have to use design for social distancing much more proactively, and we can plan in our economies for more personalized service positions. So 10 quick points. 1, the airport. There is probably the greatest asset to many city and regional economies. Someone in Canada once said to me, the Pearson Airport in Toronto is the most important economic asset, not just to Toronto, but to the country of Canada. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's damn big. This is going to be a retrofit much bigger than 9/11. It's not just going to be a TSA screen and put your stuff in a plastic bag. This is going to be a combination of temperature checks, wellness checks. If we want to open them safely, think about keeping airports closed for 6 to 12 to 18 months to hit that is. It's going to mean design for social distancing in the queue up for TSA. When you get through and go through the screen, the screening, security screening, when you're in the waiting area and at the baggage claim. We're going to have to retrofit our airports not only for health screens, and we're going to have to make sure our airport personnel and our airlines, maybe we'll fly flights not full with middle seats open, with the personal protective equipment they need. It's time to think about working with the airport authorities and others to do that. We've got to prepare our transport infrastructure, not just our airports, our train stations, our bus stops, our subways, PATH trains, all of these transit assets, get them ready so that they can reopen safely. They can be redesigned for social distancing. The transit workers have the PPE they need that, again, isn't garish, DIY, or looks like a hazmat suit. It can be done. And you already see design people coming together to try to do this. I keep thinking about this. When you go to a hotel or you get on a plane, the stewardess has an outfit, the hotel clerk has an outfit, it looks kind of nice. We can make that protective gear, and we can make it in a way that's safe for everybody. One of my friends who founded MAC Cosmetics, I asked him this. I said, what would you do to a MAC? And he said, I would pull a little fold-down shield on one of the girls' tiaras. He had answers. And how do you and do you make PPE available to customers and riders? When they get in, are there gloves, and masks handy if they forgot theirs? And assess the potential impact on congestion as people shift to car commutes, if they don't want to take transit. And then finally, what about bikeability and walkability options, bike share and scooter shares that we might need? Ready and open public spaces. We've done a great job in America and across Canada and the world in building great public spaces. We're bungling a little now. I think it's a big mistake to arrest people or to give them a citation because they went in the park. Why not put park security or hire some people to walk through the park or use police to say, folks, socially distance, physical distance, don't crowd up over here, put a mask on. Here's a mask for you if we have one. Because if you don't do that, they're going to do that in a private space, in a house or apartment where it's far more dangerous. We know that this thing travels much less outside. But we're going to have to convene to open our parks safely. My kids love to go on the swings. Mommy, Daddy, why can't we go on the swings? Well, we can disinfect the swings. We can develop ways to do social and physical distancing. I mean, I hate to be so silly. My kids are not going to wear a surgical mask and rubber gloves, but if I bought them little Disney gloves and a little Disney mask with a little princess outfit, they'd wear it. And I mean, this is stuff that these are the kinds of things as we reopen that seem so mundane. Focus on, and of course, making sure maybe we're pedestrianizing certain streets. We know the streets that people are taking to ride their bike, to get exercise, that mental health break. maybe we turn some of those, not every street, but we think, and you know, make sure there's clear lanes for social distancing. And that's paint. You know, making sure there's a bike lane. When I would walk on the West Side Highway in New York, there was a lane for walkers, there was a lane for bikers, and then there was a lane for traffic on the West Side Highway. And you know, here's one, folks, city managers. When there is a road and a thoroughfare that people are walking and biking on, get the road construction and maintenance people off that darn thing. The main thing that I see impeding social distancing on my daily walks is a landscaping crew, a road crew that parks the damn truck in the bike lane, half on the sidewalk, and then you have to walk out in the street. Prioritize the maintenance and upkeep to the other streets so that, and this sounds so simple, but it's not being done, so that people can walk and maintain and bike and maintain physical distancing. Prepare large-scale civic assets. So much money has been spent, public money, on stadiums, arenas, convention centers, performing arts centers. Are they going to open in the fall? Are you going to feel comfortable going back there? They've got to have temperature checks and wellness checks and personal protective equipment and design for social distancing, maybe empty seats in the middle. Maybe nobody's going up to a bar in a concert hall. How are you going to go to an NFL game? How are you going to go to an NBA game? How are you going to have that in your town? How about if your town's a town that has a lot of college sports? Boy, oh boy, that's something. Working now with city agencies, tourist agencies, destination marketing agencies, sports authorities, to think about what's needed downstream to reopen and ready these civic assets or reuse them. I was talking to someone yesterday who runs a community college and saying maybe some of the big classes can be broken up and they can use some other civic assets to have classes but socially distant. Release to my next point. Enlist and ready and prepare the anchor institutions, particularly universities and colleges. I am extraordinarily nervous that colleges and universities are unlikely to open in the fall. And they certainly cannot reopen unless they have a plan for all the things I talked about: health checks, protective gear, social distancing. My kids aren't college age, but my nieces and nephews are. I would send them to a class. I'm going to teach small classes. I was talking yesterday to a college president who said, I can bust up classes into classes of 30 and I can socially distance that class. But are you going to send your kid back to a big dormitory, into a big dining hall? So we're going to have to retrofit, if we want to open, dorms and dining halls with everything they need. Some of that's social distancing. Some of that's sending people in waves and smaller groups. Some of that is preparing safe sites. If kids get sick, they go to a special part of the dorm. And then here's one. In your community, what if kids don't go back to school in the fall? Every community around America has talked, except a few, talked about brain drain. I'm losing all my best and brightest to a list of 5 cities: Boston, New York, San Francisco, where the kids want to go to college, or big state universities. They're going to Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, Oklahoma, University of Texas. What if all those kids are back home with mom and dad taking remote classes? You can begin to think of community programs to engage those kids in rebuilding and reopening, a kind of AmeriCorps-like program for your town. And I think it's just things to start talking about universities and colleges about with at this moment. Assess your economy. Work with the economic development organizations, chambers, area businesses to look at the industry sectors and clusters that are hard hit versus those that aren't. And, of course, assess the fiscal. I know you're thinking about this. It's not one I have to do on. Assess the fiscal impacts of this contraction on your local revenue and spending patterns. Ensure that Main Street survives. Can you imagine, once our towns and cities come back, whether it's a big city or a small suburban town or a rural area, coming back to Main Street and literally everything's shuttered? There's, between 50 and 75% of small businesses, people say, may not be able to survive this. Mobilize financial assistance now, but prepare to reopen. You know, the big companies, the Amazons, the FedEx, the UPS, the big retail chains, Starbucks of the world, they're going to know how to reopen. They're going to understand what to do with PPE. They're going to understand how to design. Whole Foods is already doing it, socially distancing. How about your local restaurants, your local nail salons, your local hair salons, the local mom and pop shops? Who's going to help them? I've been talking to doctors and dentists, learning a ton from doctors and dentists and dermatologists about what they're going to do. Get them involved. How can you open a nail salon, hair salon? How can the small business assistance organizations not only provide financial assistance, but technical assistance for safe reopening? Same thing with the arts and creative economy. and it's even worse because they're nonprofits, many of them. They're living hand to mouth on donations. How do we get them the financial assistance they need from the philanthropic community, from the donor community? How do we prepare them with social distancing and temperature checks and PPE to reopen? One thing I like to think about, and maybe you will too, I don't think anybody's going to be going to a Taylor Swift concert or Disney on Ice or a big theatrical performance in the near term. But people are going to want some stimulation that isn't Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu in their house. You all have in your communities really great local creative communities, musicians, artists, and we can add to that chefs, restaurants, performers. Maybe some of that is personalized performance. Maybe, when my kids at Thanksgiving time got together with their cousins, we rented out, and it was cheap, a theater, and we saw Frozen 2 with 30 cousins. All, we were spaced out because of a big theater. But you can imagine people going to movie theaters and renting out a theater to see a film with trusted family and friends. You could see them wanting a performance on a street or as a block party with distancing. You could see them even going to some venues with trusted family and friends, maybe a group of no more than 50, and having a chef come in and prepare food, or going to a restaurant or music venue. You can create a portal for local creatives and performances and personalized provision as you reopen that would stimulate the local creative economy. We got to make sure to protect those the frontline service workers. It's really important that they get the money. I know I'm tipping like crazy, but that's not enough. We got to work with the local stores to make sure they have the PPE and the delivery. And then finally, we have to protect the less advantaged communities. As I mentioned before, this virus is hitting hardest at our poorest and least advantaged communities. It's time we understand what's happening there, and for all of our well-being, that the spread of this virus is mitigating. Of course, it's the morally right thing to do. It's the economically and socially just thing to do. But to the degree our communities are disadvantaged and suffer from the multiple myriad problems of disadvantage, health, fitness, they're vulnerable, and we're all vulnerable. So we have to think long and hard now, harder than ever, from a socioeconomic point of view, from a resiliency point of view, and a health point of view, about how to protect and upgrade our less advantaged communities. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Richard. At this time, we'll open it up for participant questions. We look forward to hearing from you. To submit a question, simply type into the chat area on the lower left of your screen, and then be sure to click the send button. Please note that your question will not be viewable to other attendees. We already have several questions that are in the queue at this time, so I'll go ahead and read the first one. In thinking about recovery, what do you think we should be considering in terms of going beyond returning to pre-existing conditions? With natural disasters like hurricanes, there is a lot of discussion about not just building back, but building back better.
Well, I think 100% better said, very nicely said, and I will use that in future versions of this presentation. I mean, building back better is just brilliantly said, and I think it goes for everything I talked about, from reopening airports to reopening civic assets to reopening transport infrastructure to our parks. Building back better, more resilient, healthier, and more securely. And I think that, and a lot of this is low-hanging fruit. I mean, I just want to distinguish. I mean, some of it, retrofitting parts of an airport, probably going to take some bucks. But some of it is painting circles and lines and, just designed for social distancing. And we should distinguish between the two. But I think all of this, because I don't think this is our first issue with, I think we're going to see more of this. So building back better for health and safety, for equality, if you will, for inclusiveness, and for resiliency. And now I don't want to be a climate change preacher, but I think, thinking about how our rebuild intersects with threats from climate change or other natural disasters is really smart. So the more of that we can do, the better.
Thank you. Next question is a two-part question. Can we expect increased clustering of supply chain support in the urban and increasingly away from rural to avoid future impact to industry? And do we see evidence that the issue of transport to rural may have a greater impact than the fear of concentrated populations in the urban?
I don't know on the second one. I think that the transportation to rural will be people driving more. And what what I kind of see happening in terms of commutation patterns, some of the rural areas that were very attractive were attractive because they were on transit and transport lines, rail lines. People will probably avoid them. And the people who are heading to rural areas probably can work remotely quite a bit of the time. So I think those folks will head out to rural areas, and they'll depend on their car more, at least for a while, instead of the train and transit. So I think the rural trend is here to stay, and the transport issue will be more substituting car for others. I think there will be effect on supply chains, and I think this is really fascinating. I don't think it really matters if the supplier is, I don't know, 12 hours versus an hour. You know, that's not going to matter. And we can look. One place we can look is at the supply chains in the auto industry. I haven't done it in a long time. I researched this 20 years ago, but you can be pretty far stretched out and move things. I think what we're likely to see across the world is a repatriation of supply chains. And here's something that I think is very interesting. And it came from talking to a group of economic developers, not from me the other day. What you typically hear from more economic nationalists is decrease our dependence on Chinese or other suppliers, bring the stuff back home and have U.S. companies do it. I think that's a simple-minded notion. I would think the better notion is to go to trusted suppliers in Asia or Europe and say, we need you to establish a factory here in the United States or here in Canada or here in Europe. We're too exposed if the stuff's going over continents. And the analogy I draw is to the transplants in automotive that I did research. One of the things I think the U.S. did really well in the 1980s and 90s was go to the German and Japanese manufacturers and said, if you would come to the United States and open a factory and bring suppliers and work with our companies, we'll welcome you. And I think that's a better approach. And, you know, especially as someone who spends at least half the year in Canada. For a smaller country like Canada, I think that's imperative. Canada is not going to be able to build up all of its supply chain. It's going to need American companies and European companies and Asian companies. But I think it is also true for the United States. What we found in the experience of the transplant manufacturers, is they made everybody better. The American companies got better. The American suppliers got better. The American suppliers developed global customers and put plants in Asia and Europe. So I think localizing global supply chains is probably the way to think about it rather than nationalizing supply chains.
And your next question, as someone who works in municipal environmental sustainability in Silicon Valley, predictions of increased car commuting and suburban development is scary because they are bad for climate change. How can we mitigate those behavioral preferences to still guide people toward climate smart choices?
So here's where I think we come in, city managers, the urban leadership community. We have to not only say that, we've got to make these choices safe. So that's why I say prepare the transit and train. If you perceive that you can get on a train and it's safe, you'll get on a train. If you can perceive that you'll get on transit and it's safe, you'll get on transit. If you think it's dangerous and people aren't wearing personal protective equipment, they're not socially distancing, the waiting room is, a mess, you're not going to go. So we have to prepare for that. And I think the other thing is remote work. I think we now know that remote work, look, there has been studies, I don't know if I believe them, but of Wuhan, China, and of Los Angeles, that say the reduction in pollution in those places has led to drastic reductions in pollution-related deaths and morbidity. Maybe not enough to offset the deaths from the virus, but huge reductions. So I think that we have something that people can say. The air is cleaner. Our place is more sustainable. It's nicer to get outside. We don't see smog and fog. But we're going to have to lead on that. And I think we have to put health and safety first. We don't want to make it look like it's our agenda versus whatever that agenda is. Health and safety first, but we can start to point to other potential issues downstream. And that would make us safer and secure. So that's what I think. If we don't want people to ride cars to work, if we don't want stretch out, we're going to have to convince them that density and that transit and trains are safe. And that's why I'm saying plan now for phase 2. If we plan now and it looks safe and is safe, we can abet some of those other behaviors.
Many of the businesses that make our cities unique are the ones that have been hardest hit. The coffee shops, art galleries, small theaters, and microbreweries. How can we help them recover so that our places stay unique?
So, I think this is something that not only the federal government needs to take seriously, that states and municipalities. I think it's really interesting. I wrote this book, New Urban Crisis, and I think I mentioned it at the last national meeting I talked to, global meeting I talked to in San Antonio. It was interesting to go back on book tour because I went to so many, the Milwaukees, Indianapolis, Columbus, Tulsa. I could go down a list of smaller places I went all across this country. And I said to myself, oh my God, the coffee shops are fantastic. The restaurants are fantastic. The local boutiques are unbelievable. And I love New York, but it's better than what I could see in New York or San Francisco because those places are so darn expensive that we were seeing such an incredible thing happening in our communities where chefs and restaurateurs and fitness professionals, you can go down the list, high-tech startups, were going to these places and saying, maybe it's my hometown, maybe it's my adopted hometown, but I can get an affordable space. So I think the communities that really double down on this, that say, you know what, I'm going to protect my small businesses, my Main Street businesses, my coffee shops, my microbreweries. I'm going to go the extra 9 yards with financial assistance. I'm going to mobilize local financial assistance. I'm going to get professionals in my community to work with them. I'm going to work to provide technical assistance so that they can reopen safely. I'm going to create that personal portal, personalized services portal for musicians and artists to go to people's homes or for people to book venues. That's what I think they're going to get a competitive advantage. Those communities are people who are going to say, oh my God, I'll move there because it's not a dead-end place. It has excitement. So I think that's an area where communities can really help themselves and to find a competitive advantage.
Next question. The level of mobilization in the U.S. is amazing and the scales of funding is astounding. But one has to wonder, what if we came up with that kind of funding for preparedness? Would things be different now for COVID-19?
Yes, and I think that's where we've got to go. We're always just to the next step. In this one, we've got to be 2 steps ahead. And I think this is a preparedness. This is kind of like a Marshall Plan for rebuilding our economy, really is what we're talking about, not a stimulus. And that's where we have real capability, that we can organize this preparedness. And, it's really interesting to me. Like certain leaders have made their names, Governor Cuomo, Governor Newsom, Governor Whitmer, as the mobilizing governors. For politicians, for people you work with and sometimes serve, there's going to be an opportunity for mayors and governors to be the reopening, the preparedness ones. The next phase of this in, just a few weeks is going to be who's going to step forward with the plan to rebuild and reopen their state? Who's going to step forward with the plan to rebuild and reopen their community? So there's political, there's political stuff here too. And so I think that arming our communities for preparedness, recovery and reopening, and that's the stuff that's going to last. The mobilization we'll see, but it's because all of it, this isn't just, the difference between disaster relief is it's usually one town. New York after 9/11, New Orleans after Katrina. This is a country. So the places that really begin to take this seriously, they'll become models. And then others will emulate them and we'll learn from one another. So yeah, I think taking preparedness seriously and taking it seriously now is just, it's the next step we have to take.
Thank you. Next question. Many communities host special events and large festivals. What is the future for our cities hosting these events and festivals?
I don't think we're going to see a large festival for a while. Now, is that a year? I'm not sure. But, and one of my colleagues is an expert, literally the world expert on music festivals. Outdoor may be a little easier, but not that much. So I think we got to think about what are the alternatives to large festivals, and how do we begin to think about a period of a year to 2 years until we get a vaccine or really good therapies that we're going to be, they're going to be like the last things to come back. And how do we begin to think about what that would look like and what we can do in the interim that bring people together? That's why I think smaller groups, personalized services, maybe breaking up a large festival into different small pieces and staging it, we're going to have to be very creative. And I think the same is true with professional sports and college sports. We are going to have to think large gatherings, or any place that has a large gathering is going to be an issue for a long time. So that's where we need to be really proactively and strategically thinking. And maybe that's a 12-month horizon. Maybe that's not the 6-month horizon. But we've got to be planning for that now.
What's the downside of over-planning for another COVID versus something unknown? We could see a disease that spreads differently, affects people differently, et cetera. And what about addressing the underlying social factors that make some people more vulnerable?
Yes to all of that. So I think the preparedness should be a preparedness that thinks about the 3 stages. That's all. Mobilization, reopening, and recovery. That's going to differ by the different kind of shock or virus or thing we're hit with. And it needs to take into account all of those socioeconomic factors. And, you know, it's exposing a vulnerability in our society in a new way. Let me give you one example. If you had asked me a month ago, would we see a labor organizing movement of service workers, of gig workers, I would have said, are you crazy? Gig workers, they're highly individualized, they're doing these jobs, they're working for Instacart or Uber or Lyft or whatever. We are seeing a labor movement that I talked to a historian yesterday that looked to him like the organization of steel workers and auto workers in the early part of the 20th century. These frontline workers realize that they're the heroes of this, that they're horrifically underpaid, that they're not getting they're carrying this damn economy, and they're being sent out there with masks and scarves and latex gloves. And many of them realize these people are very smart, because I grew up with them. I grew up working class with a father with a 7th grade education, that they're working for some of the biggest, most well-capitalized, fastest-growing companies in the world, whether they're big delivery companies, startup companies, or big grocery chains. So they're saying, we're going to have job actions. We're going to have strikes. What are you going to do without delivery workers? What are you going to do without warehouse workers? How can you function? So I think we are going to see some organization that's different. We're going to see pressure from below that's different because people realize how important they are. Now, it took another 20 years for that to register in our American politics. It took the New Deal, the Great Depression, and the war until folks like my dad had a good job. My dad said, it took 9 people. He was born in the 20s. It took 9 people to support his family in the 1930s. It wasn't until the 1950s, when he got back from World War II, that he had a good job in the same factory, could buy a house and, get married and have us 2 kids. So it may be, and the thing that's daunting to me is that what came after 1918 pandemic wasn't an era of civic mindedness. It was the Roaring 20s. A period we look back in disdain and, Great Gatsby and all of this stuff. So, but I think that all that said, we are beginning to see less advantaged communities and less advantaged frontline workers, who are often the same, or there's a lot of overlap, say, take us more seriously. We are the lifeblood of your economy. And I do see them making inroads with us. I see professional workers and knowledge workers saying, they've got a point. And, it sounds silly, but I get the emails every day. I'm tipping 30%. Can I tip more than 30%? These people are our heroes. Now, there are little things, but there's a consciousness shift going on in our society that gives me some hope that now would be a time to address some of these inequities, social factors, as we prepare our communities to be better in the long run.
And your next question, Richard, how do we begin to foray into recovery discussions when so many colleagues are still unable to see beyond the immediate mobilization conversations?
Well, from a city manager point of view, I think you use people like me. You use the people who have slack. The economic development professionals, the destination marketing convention people. You don't take your medical and emergency providers or your cycles. Your cycles are just too valuable for immediate mobilization. But there are other parts of the local organizational civic environment that you can empower, and parts of not just the local, the university and community college, the transit and transport authorities. There's some slack there. Not everyone is on the front lines of mobilization. You can use other experts. When we talked to this community college the other day, she said, the dean of my nursing faculty wants to move up in leadership. And, we're closed down now. She's teaching a few classes online. What if I made her our reopening czar? And what if I tasked her with preparing the community college to reopen because she knows a lot about infectious disease? And I said, and what about your nursing students? What if, instead of going on online classes as you reopen, you take your nursing and healthcare students and they're the proctors for the classrooms? So you don't have a bunch of people in, medical garb. You have other students doing a health screen, giving a temperature check, asking people about where they've been, have they coughed in the past few days. And it all looks like part of the campus. So there is slack, and that's where I'm saying find those resources, start those working groups. Obviously, you can't move people out of the mobilization effort, but you can begin and work with other experts, university experts, business experts, experts in the community that want to help and are trying to, and they're just going stir crazy in their, that the airport authorities that want to think about reopening. Get them involved in this and get them doing the second stage reopening and then third stage recovery planning.
If your community is a primary tourism focus that is a driving destination, how do you suggest they plan for a reopening?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot, and in fact, Brookings did an analysis of this, and we did an analysis of this. I mean, many of the places that are most vulnerable to this virus are primary tourism destinations, and they win a double whammy because not only are they vulnerable to this because of the nature of their workforce and their economies, they're the ones that are going to get economically hit hardest. Look, I would be in conversations with people like Disney and other big tourism providers about what they're going to do. I think convening if you're in Las Vegas, all of the convention and casino folks, the big hospitality chains, the Marriotts of the world, talking to your hotel folks about what they're going to do to reopen and how to reopen safely. I would take this very seriously. All cities, all communities have some tourism component, but some of them are much more tourism-based than others. And I would get on that yesterday. And it's really thinking about a reopening strategy. Are there ways, Indianapolis would be another one that has built so much of its economy on college sports. How do you begin to think about that in a way that enables you to reopen safely and securely? I've been working with colleagues on sports and what you can do in sports and how you might be able to do it. But I think every community is different, and that's what I would be thinking about. What are the threats to my economy? What are the sectors that are very exposed? And in those sectors, how can I reboot and reopen them in the quickest and safest fashion?
Should building codes be amended to add separation into new residential construction preparation for the next pandemic and the next quarantine?
Probably not, but I'd want to think about and I think that's an area where we can start a national task force, right? We can get a national task force together on what needs to be done there. We don't need to do that community by community. I think thinking about with the home building community, how you would retrofit areas of the house that would be safer if you needed to put someone in a more of an isolation. But no, I don't think that. I think we may learn a lot from retrofitting, say, hotels. I don't think we're going to be, I was talking to friends in Hong Kong yesterday, and one of the young women in their office went to visit, she's a Brit, a lot of Brits in Hong Kong, long history of that, went to visit mom and dad at Christmas. Somebody in the extended family was diagnosed with COVID-19. She wasn't. They sent her to quarantine camp. It was just mind-boggling. Quarantine camp. For 2 weeks, she had to go to a special place. She couldn't go home. We're never going to, there is no way that's going to happen in the United States. People are not, they're not sending me away from my kids to quarantine camp. But there are ways for us to think about retrofitting our homes. And we do, one of the good things about, from this point of view, is that many of us live in bigger houses. We have enough bedrooms. Some people would say too much. It's suburban sprawl. But the way in which to make sure those places are safe, yeah. And one of the things that's very interesting is people do respond to information. I have good friends in Sweden. And I was saying, what's going on in Sweden? You know, why aren't you locking down? Why are you a bunch of bozos over there? And she said to me, no, we are. She said, we just don't have a national policy for it. I don't go to restaurants. My kids' school their kids' school has been closed. My parents, who are older, are in isolation. We Swedes just listen to experts, and we do it when we have information. And in fact, there's a new study out of MIT that said people began socially isolating, pulling their kids out of school. School districts began closing down well before there were formal lockdowns. So I think really good information to people about how to do this, rather than having to do just a building code retrofit, that may be even more helpful.
Thank you. Next question. Are there counties that have begun to rethink service delivery to the community? And if so, can you share those that could be best practices?
Not yet. I think you know, if you look at the Bloomberg What Works Cities, you guys at ICMA, National League of Cities, are beginning to compile those lists. In fact, Mark and I had a conversation about teaming on some of that with our kind of big picture view, and then all of the ability of your team and staff to collect more specific from the members best practice information. I think that will be out there. I just know that I work with a few communities. I've been working with Tulsa. Because it's my hometown, I've been doing a project with my original hometown, Newark, and a few others, and we have been doing some of this, and I know what's going on in those communities because I was working there. But no, I think this is going to become something that's highly quested after. Right now, it's how do you get that small business assistant? How do you get surge capacity? Governor Cuomo saying, we are going to develop protocols in New York for developing surge capacity and sharing ventilators and, you know, recommissioning hotels and blah, 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 that we can then pass on to other communities who are hit by, hopefully not, hit by later waves of this. I think we're going to see it with preparedness too. We're going to see certain communities do certain things better and then share it. But no, I think people are just beginning this conversation now, because we're all this is one of the most scary anxiety, certainly in my life, producing events I've ever been through. So I think people were just in terror to begin, and then immediate mobilization. But now I think we're getting the breathing room to begin to do exactly what you say.
How do we build bridges across multiple siloed departments to develop new thinking around resilient projects and these new frameworks?
Post-COVID-19 task forces on the XYZ 10 points I said, exactly what to do. And you don't think you have to mush them together or be heavy-handed. Just say, look, we got to get our airports up and running. We got to get our transit up and running. We got to make Main Street survive. We got to make sure we have an arts and cultural sector. And I think for people, schools, you know, nothing is more important to most parents than school. Now, elementary schools are probably easier. Preschools, because they're small, and you can do the classes small, and everybody can bring a bag lunch and eat in their little station. High schools are harder. High schools are big, and then universities and colleges. But, you know, if you want your kids to go back to school in the fall, let's get over this silo stuff, people. You know, let's start thinking about how our community can work. If you want your kids to be able to go to a park and play safely. So I think it's really using the working groups, the task forces, and making people see the value of each other and each other's function, rather than trying to do a organizational rethink.
Given the potential for shifts in the distribution of population and tax base between urban metros, suburbs, and rural areas, what kind of regional cooperation and structures are necessary to address the shifting needs?
That is a brilliant question. And I'm stealing that for my next iteration of the slide deck. This is a highly localized virus in that it hits certain neighborhoods, exposed neighborhoods, less advantaged neighborhoods, harder than others. Look at New Orleans, look at Detroit, look at New York, right? It's hitting the less advantaged neighborhoods, the neighborhoods with people of color, the neighborhoods that have the highest socioeconomic disadvantage, the greatest percentages of frontline workers, multifamily living. But it's a regional problem. You look at New York, and it's spreading all throughout my home state of New Jersey, and I've been in touch with Governor Murphy. So this is a regional problem. The health problem is regional, and as the question said, the revenue problem is regional. Maybe it's time to really think about this now. And you know what's interesting? If you had asked me a month ago, I had bemoaned this Amazon HQ2. Everyone knows that. I was outspoken. I don't like the incentives and blah, 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 blah. And I encouraged mayors and states and governors to create a consortium. And, of course, that was like literally a Led Zeppelin. It just fell out of, no one cared. But now you see Governor Newsom and Governor Cuomo and others saying, we need a consortium of states and governors to make sure we have what we need and we can share. This might be the time, because of the health implications and their regionality, to do it. I never thought you'd get a consortium of states and localities to cooperate like that. We're getting it. So really, disasters breed strange bedfellows. I think the time to think regionally is now, and set up a task force or a working group of how do we address these regional fiscal impacts, and get over this beggar thy neighbor thing, because I think you're right. It's going to have very uneven regional fiscal impacts. Now, we have regional asset districts, right? Pittsburgh, where I lived for a long time, had a regional asset district, which is a tax levy. I think it was a hotel tax levy. I'm not complete. Hotel tax levy that was then shared across the region for major civic infrastructure assets. But I think we can do more of that.
National broadband strategy and development seems essential. How do we get beyond winners and losers in the great digital divide?
I mean, imagine we were going through this crisis without the internet we have today. I mean, it's unfathomable. Like, we're doing this conference. My kids are doing school. Like, my delivery, my Instacart, everything that's keeping us functional and mitigating the information we're learning about how to keep ourselves safe is all coming through this pipe. So yeah, this is an area where we're going to need better state, regional, and national cooperation. And, I mean, people talk about the electric grid, which is really important, but the internet grid, the broadband grid, is equally important. So 100%. And then, people talk about the inequity. We're very fortunate that we're all connected. I have a cell phone running and a computer running off the internet here, talking to all of you. There are kids throughout this country in urban and rural areas that have no access to the internet. How are they going to learn? How are they going to connect? And of course, people. So yeah, 100%. This is something we need to pay a lot more attention to.
How do you think the housing market, especially affordable multi-family housing, will be affected? The community I work for is almost 50% 3+ unit housing, with many cities trying to densify their housing. How will that look into recovery stages and after COVID-19?
So I think there's going to be an opportunity for affordable housing across the board, because I think there's going to be carnage in the commercial part of the economy. I just think parts of the office market, and not just the big towers, suburban office parks, people aren't going to, they're just not going to be the demand. Hotels, B and C class hotels, malls, these old suburban malls, which, malls are another thing that's going to be hard to reopen, and the old suburban dead mall, if you will, so-called dead malls, all of that has potential for reconvertibility into housing. So I think with some smart strategy, we're going to see a lot of potential retrofits, adaptive reuse for housing. And that could be a very good thing, not just in the urban core, but in suburbs and even parts of rural areas. There's going to be real estate assets that are going fallow that can be turned into affordable housing. So yeah, I think that's an area for thought and an area for strategy.
Thank you. And Richard, we have time for one last question today. Maybe you were getting at some of this in the push and pull places, but what do you see as some of the silver linings for urban places and opportunities to take advantage of?
Well, first of all, and I don't want to sound like Pollyanna here, I think when all is said and done and the Monday morning quarterbacking is over, we're going to see that we, by pulling together from the ground up, bungled federal government for sure, but from the ground up, we created a public health miracle. I mean, this could have been something far worse. So I think the silver lining is what we're doing now, that Americans are social and physical distancing, they're pulling together, they're mobilizing, and we are going to get these preparedness plans. I know I've been preachy, but because I want all of you to do it and I want us to do it together, but I'm telling you, we're going to get this. The United States is going to mobilize across its 50 big metros and 390 mid-sized metros and countless rural areas, because that's what we do. We're going to get it, for sure. I think the silver lining is that our cities will emerge stronger, that there's no doubt in my mind that our cities will emerge stronger, that whether it's New York or Toronto or London or Chicago, they're going to come through this. Detroit, Pittsburgh. People are going to be scared for a while, but the silver lining is we're going to make it. The only worry I have is that we're going to forget, that we're going to end up like me. I didn't know I was born in the middle. My parents didn't tell me I was born in the middle of a pandemic. I had no knowledge of 1918. It was like collective unmemory. I hope that this stays in our minds and that it's always there, that we need to be safe and secure and prepare and be ready. I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and just for anyone who wants to reach out, my email is florida@creativeclass.com, florida@creativeclass.com. You should feel very free to send me an email. I'm doing this 24/7 along with homeschooling and all the other things we're doing around the house. But yeah, this has been therapeutic. For me to do this has been therapeutic, so I want to thank you for your patience, for your questions, to Mark and ICMA for inviting me. It's really been just important for me to do it, and thank you so much.
And with that, we must conclude today's webinar. A special thank you to our presenter, Richard Florida, and to everyone who joined us today. Please take a moment now to complete a brief evaluation of today's program by clicking on the evaluation link to the left of the screen. Your comments and suggestions are important to us as we plan future events. The survey must be completed in order to receive a certificate for this program. You can also access the survey from your ICMA University dashboard by clicking on the program title once you are logged in. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar. We hope you will join us again soon. Today's program is copyright 2020 by the International City-County Management Association with all rights reserved. And this does conclude today's program. Have a wonderful day. You may now disconnect.